In July of 2016, Stranger Things premiered on Netflix. The show, about a group of small-town kids encountering a monster from an alternate dimension, was an instant hit both critically and commercially. 9 years later, this November 2025, the final season will air. In September 1993, The X-Files premiered on Fox. The show, about a pair of FBI agents investigating paranormal phenomena, was an instant hit both critically and commercially. 9 years later, in May 2002, the final season aired. Over its original 9-year run, The X-Files aired 202 episodes across 9 seasons. Each season had 20 to 24 episodes, approximately 44 minutes each, equaling roughly 148 hours of television in total. Over its 9-year run, Stranger Things will have aired 42 episodes across 5 seasons. Each season had 8 or 9 episodes averaging about 61 minutes each, or roughly 43 hours of television in total. Stranger Things will end its run with 4 fewer seasons than the original run of The X-Files. That equals about 100 fewer hours and 160 fewer episodes.
Well, if you want people to be happier, don't make them wait for 12 hours.
When The Pitt premiered earlier this year on HBO, that's HBO Max. No, hold on, it's Max. Wait, I'm being told it's back to HBO Max? When The Pitt premiered earlier this year, its first season was 15 episodes long. That might not seem that impressive, but in an era when most streaming shows have seasons that are only 10, 8, sometimes just 6 episodes long, it felt like a revelation. Of course, broadcast shows like Chicago Fire, FBI, Matlock, and Grey's Anatomy will still regularly air 18 to 22 episodes per season, but it is much less common for streamers to do so. Along with The Pitt's slightly larger episode order, there's one way in particular that The Pitt is reviving traditional television for the streaming era. When the show was renewed, producer John Wells announced that he intended to have season 2 ready to air within a year. Now, there was a time when such a statement would not have raised any eyebrows. That was just how TV worked. But today, in 2025, it's practically revolutionary.
Well, if you want people to be happier, don't make them wait
2 years between seasons. It's not unusual these days for streaming shows to take 2 or even 3 years between seasons. Some recent examples include Severance, Andor, House of the Dragon, Wednesday, The Rings of Power, The Wheel of Time, The Sandman, The Last of Us, The White Lotus, Yellow Jackets, and Poker Face. Also, I want to make very clear that this video is not reviewing the quality of any of these shows. Some of them I like very much. Others, less so. Which ones? I'll never reveal that unless we meet up in person and get drunk together. Then I probably won't shut up about it.
Stop remembering TV and get back to work.
For decades, almost all new American TV shows would premiere in the fall of every year. This seasonality actually developed because of the automobile industry. You see, the auto industry has traditionally been one of the largest advertisers on TV, and the car companies happened to release their new models in the fall. So they wanted to have fresh new episodes of television that would attract viewers so more people would see their ads. And since they poured so much money into those ads, networks were happy to oblige. Over the years, the TV industry adapted and grew around this basic annual schedule. With a few exceptions, pilots were ordered in the winter, written in the early spring, and shot in late spring. If the network liked the pilot, they'd order the show to series. The show would then shoot most of the rest of the series in the summer and broadcast in the fall. Particularly for new shows, networks would usually only order a handful of episodes. Once the show proved to be a hit, or at least popular enough, the show would get picked up for the remaining season. Most shows, both dramas and comedies, would have between 20 and 24 episodes each season. This meant, most of the time, shows would still be shooting new episodes while they were airing. Essentially, they were laying down tracks just in front of the train. Shows that didn't do well in the ratings would be canceled. Depending on how big of a flop the show was, it would usually air its remaining episodes that had been shot, but the network wouldn't order any new ones. But if it was a really big bomb, it would often be replaced within a few episodes, usually with reruns of existing popular shows. Mid-season shows existed to replace unpopular shows that didn't get ordered to a full season. These mid-season shows were often pilots that had been ordered by the networks earlier the past year, but they hadn't been picked up for a full season in the fall. This could be because the network didn't trust the quality or they didn't think the show would find an audience. As a result, mid-season shows often had a reputation for being lower quality. Some of that reputation was well-deserved, but a lot of it definitely wasn't. Did you know that all of these shows were actually mid-season replacements? So that's fun. Because TV shows used to be strictly linear, networks had to fill literal airtime. They had a set number of hours each week, and if they didn't have the content, they would just have dead air. Of course, much of that time was filled with local news, sports, game shows, talk shows, infomercials, and soap operas. The prime time hours were generally between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. Sunday through Thursday, and they were reserved for hour-long dramas, half-hour comedies, and later on, reality shows. These shows, especially the popular ones, commanded the highest ad rates. Since there were a limited number of hours, networks could only have a set number of shows per week. This also meant a quick cancellation if a show was not drawing enough viewers to command those higher ad rates. When Netflix started streaming online, its priorities were completely different from traditional networks and cable channels. Netflix didn't have any ads, so it didn't have to appeal to advertisers or brands. It also didn't have a set amount of airtime to fill. It could upload as much or as little as it wanted. The only limitations were server space and the money it could spend on distribution rights. And when Netflix first started producing its own shows, it adopted the prestige strategy, modeling its initial offerings after the Emmy-winning high-class series at FX, AMC, and especially HBO. These shows were defined by their use of A-list talent, cinematic compositions, and crucially, shorter episode orders, usually 10 to 13 episodes per season. Ted Sarandos famously said Netflix needed to become HBO before HBO became Netflix. And to his credit, that's more or less what it did, at least for a while. Netflix's first original shows were House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. Yes, Lilyhammer was technically the first, but Netflix definitely marketed the latter two much more as their official kickoff series. So we're gonna go with that. The two shows felt very much like they would have been at home on HBO or FX. As I mentioned, Netflix didn't need to adhere to a fall premiere schedule, and that also meant its shows didn't need to be produced with the same deadline. If a network didn't get a show it ordered in time, it would have to fill that time slot with something. If Netflix didn't get the show on time, it could just wait until it did. House of Cards premiered in February 2013, while Orange is the New Black premiered that July. While Netflix started out producing original content that emulated prestige channels like HBO and AMC, they quickly expanded their offerings. Again, this made sense. While Netflix didn't have to worry about filling actual airtime, it also meant that once they ramped up, Netflix also didn't have to worry about too much content either. As long as they could buy more server space, sky was the limit. And for a subscription service looking to expand its user base, that was perfect. House of Cards might get Emmy nominations, but shows with more populist appeal like Bridgerton, Money Heist, and Wednesday were needed for the service to truly grow.
Everything's computer.
A surprisingly common argument I saw on some of the other videos about this topic is that shows take longer now because they're more complex. My big issue with this is that more complex is often a bit ill-defined, and several people seem to be conflating it with more cinematic or just generally bigger in scope. And I do understand that impulse. It makes a certain logical sense, but unfortunately there's no real evidence to support this theory. A big part of the appeal of prestige TV was how it felt like a long movie. Shows like Mad Men, True Detective, Breaking Bad, and The Sopranos felt more epic because they would often use cinematic visual language. Think of the dream sequences in The Sopranos, or the desert landscape interstitials in Breaking Bad, or just the entire production design of Mad Men. But where these shows upped their complexity in terms of locations, set pieces, budgets, and name talent, they were actually simpler in a lot of other ways. One that I already mentioned was their generally shorter seasons. Rather than 22 or 24 hours of television, they'd only have to produce 13 hours. That meant smaller writers' rooms and shorter production windows. Oftentimes, they'd have fewer directors, and sometimes, such as the case with True Detective Season 1, they'd only have one director. On the technical side of things, shows today all shoot digitally rather than on film. Fully digital workflows are definitely faster than the old DI era, where you'd have to print the negatives and ingest the footage. That's not a huge factor, but I think it's worth noting. The cast sizes of modern shows are essentially on par with past shows, but scenes with lots of extras are actually less common now because extras can often just be recreated with VFX. And speaking of VFX,
everything's computer.
The one area that I will concede shows are more complicated today than they were in the past is in their widespread use of visual effects. That is definitely one of the reasons things take longer now. So put a pin in that because I am going to circle back. Basically, my point is that if your entire argument is that shows today take longer simply because they are just more complex, I don't fully agree. Sometimes they are more complex, but just as often they aren't. Not to mention, all the prestige shows I referenced above, for the most part, would release new seasons every year, just like the old network model. And if you're still not convinced, let me remind you of one show. Game of Thrones was an immensely complex production. It filmed across multiple countries, it had a huge, sprawling cast, it had a very big writer's room, it required massive sets, bespoke costumes, realistic props, and of course, CGI dragons. Despite all of this complexity, right up until season 8, every single season of that show came out just a year after the previous one. There are lots of complex shows out there today like Rings of Power, Severance, Wednesday, Stranger Things, and The Wheel of Time. But are any of those actually more complicated than Game of Thrones was? I'd argue no. I'm going to keep this segment short because yes, they both had a very big impact, obviously. But the pandemic has been over for years now, at least in terms of how people deal with it, and we're approaching 2 years since the strikes, so I'd say the excuses are starting to wear a little thin. These days, almost every streamer shows ads, just like in the old days. And as Netflix, Amazon, and HBO Max mature, their priorities are shifting from attracting new viewers to simply keeping those viewers subscribed to the platforms. In other words, they want to keep people from canceling their subscriptions, and a good way to do that is to give people more of the shows they love, like, for example, Severance and Wednesday. I'd like to note that I know Apple doesn't have ads, but it does want to keep people subscribing, so I think the argument still works. Despite this desire to reduce churn, Wednesday took 2 years to release its second season. Severance took 3 years. You know how a lot of people tend to refer to a season of prestige TV as a long movie? Well, movies often go through years of development and pre-production, which means producers who are brought into the TV industry from the film industry are often used to long lead times. Meanwhile, producers who had worked for years in the broadcast and cable models were gradually being replaced by these film producers. So that institutional knowledge has been lost over time. TV and film share a lot of similarities, obviously, but they are extremely different art forms with different workflows, or at least they used to be. So because streamers didn't need a bunch of new shows every fall, if a new season fell behind a bit, it wasn't a huge deal. Especially in the era of peak TV, when there were so many new shows, it was basically impossible for viewers to keep up anyway. So what if The Handmaid's Tale took 3 years for its final season to premiere? There was plenty else to watch anyway. Until there wasn't. 2021 was the peak of TV production with 600 new scripted series released. Since then, production is down year over year across the board. COVID, the strikes, inflation, and subscriber slowdowns led to a contraction in budgets as streamers moved from prioritizing growth to prioritizing retention, meaning less content overall. The lack of deadlines also coincided with a rise in A-list talent on TV. It used to be the case that an A-list actor would only appear on TV if they were basically no longer an A-list actor, or maybe they were doing a bit of stunt casting for Sweeps Week or something. For those of you too young to remember, Sweeps Week was a whole thing where shows would do a bunch of crazy to increase viewership to help set the highest possible ad rates for their shows. You know the term jumping the shark? That was a Sweeps Week stunt. Anyway, once prestige shows removed the stigma of being on TV, A-list actors flocked to it. And having an A-lister headlining your show can be great. It can draw a lot of attention and a lot of awards. But it also means that the actor has a lot more leverage and is generally just busier. There used to be an old adage that stars don't make TV, TV makes stars. And it was pretty true. Today's A-listers like George Clooney, Chris Pratt, Amy Adams, Jim Carrey, and Jennifer Lawrence all started on TV before they moved to film. Or for another example, the cast of Friends were eventually able to renegotiate for much larger paychecks once the show became a hit. But in those first few seasons, they were stuck with the relatively small sums that they'd agreed to in their initial pre-fame contracts. That's a much easier thing to do with a nobody than with, say, Pedro Pascal. Along with A-list talent, many shows now also employ A-list directors and producers. Tony Gilroy, Tim Burton, David Fincher, and Ben Stiller are all very busy people, and aligning their schedules with those of their famous collaborators can prove to be very tricky and time-consuming. Alright, remember how I said I'd come back to VFX? Well, I'm back to VFX. Lots of shows these days rely as heavily on VFX as any big movie does. And that's actually a problem because there's a limited number of VFX houses, and the economics of the VFX industry are challenging enough that that number shrinks almost weekly. VFX, especially good VFX, still takes a lot of time. So there's a bottleneck as more and more shows demand more and more work from fewer and fewer VFX houses. Networks and cable channels used to only really be in the United States, so they'd only need to be in their native English language. At most, maybe some would get a Spanish language dub. These days, streamers are international, and a lot of shows play all over the world. That means a lot more dubbing, sometimes into dozens of languages. And dubbing is a highly specialized skill. Now, it's possible that AI could speed up or even replace this process. But given how AI companies currently treat foreign languages, I suspect it would very confidently translate shows into a bunch of gibberish, kind of like that episode where Charlie thinks he's learned Mandarin.
Again, this is complete gibberish.
Unfortunately, because there are so many issues, there's no one easy fix. But that doesn't mean there's no reason for optimism. Remember the Pitt? There's no guarantee it won't fall into the same pit that other productions have fallen into. There was a lot of excited chatter around the TV industry when the Pitt came out. Creatives and executives alike are using it as an example of a new wave of TV that looks like, well, old TV. The fact that audiences embrace the show that isn't particularly cinematic is also promising. There's not a lot of flashy VFX, there's no exotic locations. It also helps that John Wells is responsible for classic TV shows like ER, The West Wing, and Shameless, so he knows how it's done, unlike a lot of his current contemporaries. But even if The Pitt comes back in 1 year with 22 self-contained 45-minute episodes, it's still just one show. We'll need a lot more shows like The Pitt getting made before we can truly say that old TV is back. But it is a start. And before you jump into the comments, let me just address the fact that yes, there are shows being made these days that do release a new season basically every year. Some of those shows include Only Murders in the Building, The Bear, Hacks, mostly. There was a 2-year gap between seasons 2 and 3, but otherwise they've been consistent. Slow Horses, actually, oftentimes in less than a year. Let me know if you think there's anything that I missed. Also, I've got a new movie coming out called Sight Unseen, and it's a horror film. It is premiering at the Maine International Film Festival on July 19th. It may have already premiered by the time you're watching this, but if not, and you're in the New England area, come hang out with us. It'll be fun. So be sure to subscribe and stay tuned, and there will be more updates on that as it happens. So thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time.